Several weeks ago, a local brewery called me up and inquired about getting a really unique coffee table. They found me here on YouTube where I showed a console table that I built several months ago, this one to be specific, and asked if I was able to make a coffee table inspired from that. So I figured, why not give it a go and dip my feet in? Unlike most clients, they wanted to give me all the artistic control. The only thing that they requested was that it was made out of red oak. Lucky for me, I had tons of red oak donated to me by a family friend, so I obliged. What you've seen me do so far is rough cut the lumber down into some oversized pieces and start the milling process. Now, I don't own a joiner, so to get a crisp edge on these boards, I use my router table. If you want more info on this process, I've got a video covering it in detail that I'll link down in the description below. With that jointed edge nice and flat, I can run all the boards through my table saw so that they come together perfectly into a large panel. I'll quickly mark a triangle, that way I can, make sure the boards are in the orientation that I want and nothing gets mixed up during the glue up. I typically would use some sort of alignment aid like dominoes, biscuits, or dowels during a panel glue up like this. But because I'm going to carve into it and I could potentially expose those aids, I'm just going to keep it nice and simple here. Just clamps. After the glue cured several hours later, I could pop the panel out of the clamps and give it a light sanding across all the glue seams.
Now I know what you're thinking, Eric, you didn't finish milling all this wood. And yeah, I know, I'm gonna come back and power carve this all, so I'm not really worried about the milling being completely flat on the top. And if you're wondering about my voice, I lost my voice. I just focus on the woodworking.
As you can probably tell, I have since found my voice, and I also found that aligning boards during a glue up is not one of my finest skills. No worries though, I just grabbed the track saw and cleaned it up. And no, you definitely do not need a track saw to make this cut. You could very easily just use a circular saw and a straight edge, but I'm just trying to minimize any potential errors. Whoops, little did I know this was going to be the least of my issues during this build. If only I knew that I was already on the road to losing thousands and thousands of dollars. But we're not there quite yet. After trimming the other end of the table to its final length, I popped the panel back up on the table saw and brought it to its final width. Now that the tabletop has been trimmed down to its final size, you might notice that there are a couple cracks and voids in the panel. Now, I want to take care of those right now, so I'm going to go ahead and fill all those up with a little bit of epoxy. Now, some of the voids, like this one here, go all the way through the table, so I'm just going to cover those up with a little bit of tape so that the epoxy doesn't flow all the way through. This Total Boat stuff is pretty cool because it's got pre-measured pumps, meaning one pump of blue, one pump of red, and you're all set. A little bit of mixing action, and then I could fill all the voids with a syringe, then come back with a heat gun to pop all the bubbles and help the epoxy flow all the way down into the voids. Once it cured the next day, I just came back with a little bit of sanding to remove the excess, and then we're all set for the fun part.
Power carving.
Hold on. Now, before I hand the reins over to her, I marked out a grid on the table to visually be able to see where the pattern was going to be carved. So for those of you who don't know, this is my girlfriend Miranda, and she's the entire reason there's ever been power carving on this channel. She's really good at it, so I'll let her take it from here.
If you've followed the channel for a while, you might know that I love power carving. I've always had an interest, and I'm so happy when Eric asked for my help with these projects. We have carved furniture before using the larger turbo plane, but today I get the opportunity to try out the smaller mini turbo plane from Arbortech, the sponsor of today's video, and I couldn't be more excited about it. Like all Arbortech power carving tools, this easily attaches to any standard angle grinder, so if you're wanting to give it a try, it doesn't require a huge investment. If you do decide that this is something you really like, Arbortech makes their own grinder called the Power Carving Unit that is specifically designed to meet the demands of power carving, and it's what we use for this table. Before I got started carving into the table, I practiced on a piece of scrap so I was able to get a better understanding of how the mini turbo worked, and it gave me some inspiration to start the actual project. When practicing, I realized that what I was carving looked a lot like tree roots, and that became my unintended goal for this project. You'll start to notice the grain comes to life in the wood once you start cutting into it at different angles. This mini turbo carver has a longer, more narrow shaft.
That's what she said.
That allows you to make more controlled cuts and helps reach into tighter spaces and create greater detailed work. If you're gonna try power carving yourself, I have 2 tips for you. 1, safety first. I may look, but it makes a mess, so do everything you can to protect yourself from the chips that fly around while carving. 2, don't limit yourself. Get into the flow and just see what happens. Power carving is a little different from woodworking in that you don't need to have precise measurements, so get creative and go with it. If you're interested in checking out any of the Arbortech tools I used to carve the table, check out the links in the description. If you're lucky, there might even be a discount code down there.
So here's how the carving ended up looking after Mandy finished. And you're probably thinking, well, that doesn't look very good. Well, hold on just a second. We still got some sanding to do. But how in the world am I gonna sand something like that? Luckily, Arbortech has this sweet sanding attachment that has a rubber head on it, so it easily contours to all the weird ridges and stuff. Their marketing department must have spent years coming up with the name for this one. It's called the contour sander. Now, this definitely made the entire sanding process easier, but the only thing worse than sanding is watching somebody else sand, so let's just move on. I'm glad that I spared you from watching me sand this because it literally took me an entire day. Yes, like 8 to 10 hours of just sanding the tabletop. So I'm glad that that's done. Now, obviously you can't set any drink or anything on this right now or the cup would just fall over. So what I'm gonna do is I'm going to flood coat this with epoxy. The only problem is that if I just pour epoxy over this, it's all gonna run over the edges. So to make sure that that doesn't go anywhere, we're gonna build an epoxy form. So let's start that. I'm far from a pro when it comes to epoxy. I don't build river tables and I really hope I never have to. So whenever a client asks me to build one, I immediately say no. But actually, I made one out of trash a couple months ago, but it didn't do too hot on YouTube. But if you want to check that out, I'll leave a link to it down in the description below. Anyway, to hold all the epoxy in, I started building up an epoxy form out of melamine. And to make sure that there was zero chance the epoxy accidentally fused to the surface, I covered everything with this waterproof sheathing tape. After pre-drilling and countersinking, I could fire in a few screws to help hold the mold together. So at this point, the mold is pretty much done and it should be just fine since I wrap everything with some Tyvek tape. But because I have to put this thing inside of my apartment, I don't want it to leak anywhere. So just as an extra insurance policy, I'm gonna take some silicone caulk and caulk all the seams. I just don't want to leak. Nothing fancy here, just run the silicone around the edges. Oh, and pro tip, wet your finger a little bit with water and it makes it much easier to spread. Now, I had thought about just taking the tabletop, putting it directly in the form and then covering with epoxy. However, I think it's going to float. So my idea here is to take something thin, like this 1/4 inch thick sheet of plywood, cover this entire thing with some double-sided tape, put some caulk around the edges, and then place that in the form. That way this will be held down to the form itself and the epoxy can get underneath the lip of the table so it's a full coverage. Is it gonna work? I hope so. Because it is way too cold inside my garage, I had to do all the epoxy work inside my apartment and had to Dextrify the whole place. I'm gonna use some of this thick set stuff from Total Boat, but before I go pour over $500 of this, I'm gonna do a thin seal coat just to help keep the bubbles under control. To make sure that I have the right ratio, I used some syringes and then stirred, and stirred, and stirred. What I'm looking for here is basically just enough to effectively paint the surface with epoxy. To make sure that all the bubbles are removed, I quickly hit it with a heat gun, which also helps clear up some of the spots that are slightly foggy. In order to keep debris out while it sets up, I set some boards across the top of the form and then covered it with a tarp. Once the epoxy set up for a few hours and started to gum up, I poured the rest of the epoxy into a large mixing bucket. Luckily, no measuring was needed here. Just dump all the containers together and bring out the paddle mixer. The pour went fantastic and it was the exact amount of epoxy that I needed. Again, just hit everything with the heat gun to pop all those extra bubbles, cover it up with a tarp to keep debris out, and let it sit for a few days. So there has been a little bit of an issue. Last night we were just about to leave and I decided I'd check in on the table and a nightmare ensued. Now, the epoxy didn't leak all over the floor. That wasn't the problem. The problem was the entire thing floated. So, what I had to do real quick, and I wasn't able to get it on camera because it was just an absolute panic moment. I basically had to take the table, flip it over, and because it was going to try to float, I had to take these 2x4 pieces right here and screw them down to the mold to try to hold this in place. Now, this is gonna be an absolute mess because the table's so wavy underneath. I know there are gonna be tons of air bubbles underneath, and you can already see all over here where all these air bubbles have started to come out. And this is why I hate working with epoxy. So now I just have to let this cure for a couple days and see what kind of disaster awaits underneath.
Later.
Now before you jump down in the comments and let me know that I did it wrong, I know I did. I had a feeling that this double-sided table wouldn't hold, but like the stubborn person that I am, I decided to take the gamble. Really, I should have driven screws in from the underside of the mold to hold the table in place. Or I should have just poured multiple thin layers of epoxy over the top and let it slowly flow over the sides. There are tons and tons of simple solutions that would have made this whole process not fail, but I'll admit it, I'm an idiot. So after several days, I was ready to face my impending doom and started to demold the tabletop. This process is super easy. Just remove all the screws holding the form together and use a hammer to knock off the walls. Now, before I even bothered to see how bad the top looked, I had to start the process of removing that extra plywood panel that had now been epoxied on. I used a multi-tool to cut through the epoxy right along the silicone caulk seam and then started the horrible task of prying off all of the extra material. This was an absolute nightmare and took me well over an hour to do. I was left with this mess, which I knew that I could salvage if I really needed to, so I figured now is time to remove the rest of the mold and see the inevitable damage on the top side. A few taps with a putty knife at each corner allowed me to pop the tabletop off the mold. And then the massive disappointment ensued. As you can see, there are bubbles everywhere. And to make it even worse, lots of the extra silicone caulk was permanently embedded inside of the table. Now at this point, I honestly thought that I might be able to make this at least tolerable to the client, so I kept pressing on, hoping to save what little I could out of this. The first step in the rescue procedure was to sand the top flat, removing small ridges from the mold, as well as trying to get rid of some of that extra caulk. Honestly, the sanding definitely helped, and it removed a lot of the caulk, so I figured now it was time to move my attention back to the bottom. To remove all the leftover junk, I brought out the power carving tools once again, which made quick work. This is the underside, so I'm not super worried about how it looks, really just as long as it's flat. So in my mind, I said, hey, I should flood the bottom of the table with some more epoxy, but to cover up the disaster I made, I should dye the epoxy black. Yeah, that's a genius idea. So I mixed up all the epoxy and spread it over the bottom of the table, and then realized that epoxy isn't paint. So there are a lot of see-through areas. Nice going, Eric. Chalk up another boneheaded move. The bottom was pretty much a lost cause, so I flipped the table back over and then flooded the top with the self-leveling tabletop epoxy to bring back that crystal clear look. Once all the epoxy was fully cured, I flipped the tabletop over and then attached these thick steel legs that I got from Semi-Exact. Before I share how the table turned out and what the client thought of it, leave a comment below that says steak sauce. Not only does that comment help me out, but if you have a question or anything that you want me to address, leaving steak sauce lets me know that you actually watched the video. All right, now let's get to the good stuff. And well, here's how it turned out. So I know the part that everybody wants to know is, what did the client think of the table? Well, I preface it to them that this table did not go as planned, and it also is not up to my quality standards. Even with that information, they asked me to bring the table by the brewery, and as you can imagine, they didn't buy it. Yeah, so that $5,000 check that they wrote me a couple weeks ago and I had cashed, I now had to write them a $5,000 check. So I guess the moral of the story is that when it comes to taking really expensive commissions on something that's a total experiment,
Rather have a beer.